All right, let's start then. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have all of you today to hear this very latest super interesting report from a team of superstars from the International Monetary Fund, a report on COVID-19 lockdowns and income inequality. We have Davide Furceri, Nour Tawk, and Tahsin Siddiq presenting the reports today. I've been asked to notify you of two things. This is being recorded, so please have your cameras off. And if by any chance your mic is not off, please make sure it is. Then with no further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Davide Furceri and report. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Nour. Thanks very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining. Today, we are going to present two analytical chapters of the recently published IMF Regional Economic Outlook on Asia and Pacific. The reason we thought to present at the UCL was twofold. One is because the analytical chapter will provide new evidence that is relevant not only for Asia, but also for many countries all around the world, including Europe, on the one hand, on the economic effect of lockdowns and containment measures, as well as its distributional impact. And the second, because as you probably will see during the presentation, actually, Asia may offer some lesson for all the other countries in the world. It was on average the region that where outbreak was firstly recorded. There were many countries that first exited the crisis, and we can draw several lessons for all countries in the world. Without much further ado, I will let my colleague Nour and Tahsin to present this chapter. First, Nour will present. Nour, to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Davide. Thank you, Nour. Good morning, everyone from DC. Good afternoon in the UK, where you are. Thank you so much for joining this outreach seminar. And let me share my screen in a minute. Okay, can everyone see the presentation? So let me just put it into full screen. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for joining our outreach session for our Regional Economic Outlook presentation. My name is Nour, and I am one of the authors of this analytical chapter, but we are a big team and everyone is, was a wonderful co-author. So on behalf of them, I'll be presenting our findings. So the analysis is based on the lockdowns and the exits from the lockdowns in Asia and some of the lessons that we derived from their experience this past year. So how do we derive these lessons? Well, we learn these lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic through quantifying the impact of containment measures on COVID-19 infections and also economic activity. Now, to do so, we combine daily data from Johns Hopkins University on COVID-19 infections and fatalities with containment measures data from Oxford University. And then we also put together a novel data set of high-frequency indicators that proxy economic activity, such as nitrogen dioxide emissions, flights, energy consumption, and mobility indicators. These are all at the daily frequency, and they allow us to assess the impact of containment measures at the daily level, instead of having to wait for lagged economic data, such as GDP or industrial production. We use local projection methods to estimate the impact of containment measures on COVID-19 infections or on economic indicators. So when you look at the equations, IT is the log of the number of infections or the economic indicators that we choose in country I at day T. CIT denotes the containment stringency index. And then we have a vector X of control variables that include, for example, daily temperature and humidity levels. Also, we include testing and tracing policies or public awareness campaigns. Also changes in mobility, like changes in mobility, in addition to country-specific linear, quadratic or cubic time trends. Then we obtain the impulse response functions through using the estimated coefficient theta h. So let's look at the initial results. What we see, and this is when you're looking at the left-hand side, is that containment measures have been very effective, and that the tightening of containment measures reduced COVID-19 infections by almost 300 log percentage points, or in other words, about 90% 30 days after the implementation of these containment measures, relative to a baseline of no containment. These containment measures, through their impact on mobility, which we see on the right-hand side, were able to reduce COVID-19 infections. Now, the effect is stronger in countries where mobility was more curtailed. COVID-19 infections, you can see that they fell at a much larger scale in countries where mobility was much more further reduced versus countries where mobility remained high. Now, while these containment measures were very effective in reducing COVID-19 infections and fatality, and therefore they laid the foundations for medium-term growth, they also led to unprecedented short-term economic costs. If you look at the left-hand side chart, we see the growth revisions for our countries relative to COVID-19 fatalities. This really reinforces the view that in countries where they were hard hit by the pandemic or they had high numbers of fatalities, growth contracted quite sharply. Meanwhile, if you look on the right-hand side, our results using nitrogen dioxide emissions, which is our variable of choice, and I'll explain that in the next slide, to proxy economic activity, we see that NO2 emissions fell almost by 99%, 30 days after the implementation of containment measures relative to a baseline of no containment. Now, these losses in NO2 emissions can be equated to a 12% decline in industrial production month on month. So how do we derive this? Well, at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that we had a large data set of high frequency indicators. But we choose to mainly focus on NO2 emissions because these emissions are strongly associated with industrial production and economic activity. They are historically linked to the combustion of fossil fuels that is caused during industrial production processes and also actually mobility. Now, to obtain the relationship we do between NO2 emissions and economic activity, we compute two exercises. The first is that we look at the relationship between man-made emissions of nitrogen dioxide over the long term, so between 1990 and 2018, and in the 38 OECD countries. And we find that they are strongly correlated with other conventional measures of economic activity, such as GDP growth, manufacturing, and industrial production. Then we use the data that we are using at a higher frequency, and we zoom in over the period that is covered by our analysis of containment measures, and we estimate the relationship between NO2 emissions and industrial production. We find that this relationship is statistically significant, and it suggests a 12% loss in industrial production due to containment measures. The results confirm also that there are losses in economic activity through the other indicators that are more sector specific. So we see that flights, energy consumptions, or mobility indicators also declined very sharply 30 days after the implementation of containment measures relative to a baseline of no containment. I won't spend much time on this slide, but this is just to show that we performed many robustness checks, and we saw that our results were quite robust to different specifications. So when we include time-fixed effects, or when we restrict the data to just the lockdown period, versus, for example, including leads of the stringency index for better identification, or contemporaneous NO2 emissions. So let's have a look at the lessons we learned from Asia. As Davide mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, countries in Asia were among the first to be hit, and many of them locked down their economies to halt the spread of the virus. they took some various steps of quick and decisive actions. And these actions allowed for some of them to gradually reopen economic activity. In order to see whether these responses helped them deal with the pandemic, we add an interaction to our baseline specifications. We use a smooth transition autoregressive model, which was developed by Granger and Terravistra, and this will allow for our countries, for the responses to vary depending on the country's characteristic. So when you look at the equations, we are adding the weighting function f of z from the model, and it will assign to each specific characteristic regime weights that vary between 0 and 1. So these weights can be interpreted as the probability of being in a given state of the economy. So, for example, if a country is using, for example, if the weight is high for fiscal, for example, if we're interacting with fiscal policy, then it means that country is using high fiscal measures versus low, etc. So let's have a look at the first lesson. The first lesson we learned from Asia speaks about the importance of acting fast. Here we computed what is referred to in the epidemiology lingo as the public health response time. And this is the number of days it's computed, or it's calculated as the number of days that it takes for a government or authorities to implement containment measures after a significant outbreak has been established in a country. This significant outbreak is equal to 100 cases, and this is in line with the epidemiology literature, which because they argue that after 100 cases have been established in the outbreak, this means that it has become localized. So we will count the number of days that the authorities implemented containment measures, and these are other than international travel restrictions, until the number of days that 100 cases had been reached. We see that on this metric, Asia did relatively well, and they acted fast. And this is possibly due to their past experience with other pandemics. This played a big part in curbing infections. So when you look on the right-hand side, we see that for countries which acted fast or had a short public health response time, containment measures were very effective. Meanwhile, in countries that responded slow or took their time, the result was not statistically significant. Our empirical evidence is also supported by the model analysis that our co-authors use in this chapter, and it's based on the susceptible, infected, recovered or removed macro model by Eichenbaum, Rebello, and Trabant. And it's interacted with fiscal policy. The model emphasizes the importance of early intervention. We see that when containment measures are delayed, the model simulations are illustrating that the cumulative number of infections is significantly higher. And we can see that from the left-hand side chart. And the reason is that, and then what this means, or what this will imply for economic activity, is that when you look at the right-hand side chart, the depth of the economic contraction will be much more pronounced. And the reason is that when you have raging infections in a country, the negative externalities that are associated with economic activity are very high. So even if containment measures are eventually introduced, this delayed response will still lead to higher fatalities and economic losses. Now let's look at lesson 2, which would be to put in place strong testing and tracing policies to avoid a second wave of infections. So strong testing and tracing policies, such as, for example, the ones that were implemented in Korea, along with targeted lockdowns, appear to have been crucial in avoiding a second spike in infections when containment is eased. The right-hand side chart shows that the rise in the number of infections 30 days after the easing of the lockdowns did not lead to a statistically significant increase in the number of COVID-19 infections in countries that had strong testing and tracing policies at the time of the exit. That is in sharp contrast with the countries that had weak testing and tracing policies. Now in Asia, turning back again to the left-hand side, testing and tracing policies at the time of the exit were generally high. This might explain the relative successes in restarting their economy without encountering a large spike in the number of COVID-19 infections, which we are witnessing in other countries. Moving on to lesson 3, which is related to the timing of the exit and getting that timing right. The results on the slide indicate that countries which eased lockdowns when new infections were very low witnessed a significant increase in mobility. Now, mobility for us can proxy two things. First is the individual behavior in relation in the fear of getting infected. Of course, when you are scared, you don't really want to go out and risk getting exposed. But at the same time, the increase in mobility is correlated with greater economic outcomes. So an increase in mobility will lead to greater economic activity. So what we do see is economic activity, which is here proxied by transit mobility, rebounds strongly in countries that have low new cases at the time of exit versus countries that exit when there are still high new cases. This points to a lack of confidence and the fear of a second wave of infections. Again, when you look at Asia on the left-hand side chart, you see that number of infections at their time of exit is relatively low, quite the lowest among all the other regions. Further empirical evidence supports this. The model simulations, which also from the SIR model, also illustrate the dire consequences of exiting too early and before the pandemic peaks. This is on the right-hand side chart. Early exits lead to a significantly higher number of infections and fatalities. And this will cause the economy to be plunged into a second recession, and it will weaken the medium-term outlook. Now, on the slide before, I showed the impact of exiting when you have low cases versus new cases on mobility, and the same holds for industrial production. We see that industrial production significantly rebounds after the easing of containment measures in countries where you have low new cases at the timing of exit versus a muted response when you have still high cases at the time of your exit. Now, last but not least, lesson 4, which is about taking action. Now, we've covered so far that the pandemic and containment measures have strong economic costs, but governments can mitigate some of these costs by using supportive macroeconomic policies, and this leads us to lesson 4, which is to continue to use macroeconomic policies to cushion the blow. So the results from our analysis, which are shown on the left-hand side chart, estimate the losses in industrial production from the decline in NO2 emissions that were caused by the tightening of containment measures. What they suggest is that in countries where high fiscal stimulus measures were used, losses in economic activity were partly mitigated. In contrast, economic losses seem much larger in those countries that did not provide or provided little fiscal support. And the same seems to hold for monetary policy. In countries where central banks implement large policy rate cuts, some of the losses of economic activity are partly mitigated. However, the losses are much more profound in countries where smaller policy rate cuts are enacted. But on the right-hand side chart, we actually take a closer look at the role of fiscal policy during the COVID-19 pandemic. We study the impact of announced fiscal stimulus measures in almost 40 countries since the beginning of the pandemic. We put together actually a daily data set for these containment measures, capturing the magnitude of the fiscal stimulus measures and also the announcement date of the implementation date of the announcement date, not the implementation date of the fiscal stimulus packages. What we find is that fiscal measures have a positive impact on economic activity, but this can vary in magnitude depending on a country's characteristic. First, this impact is stronger in countries with more closed economies because any additional demand from a fiscal expansion is less likely to be leaked out through higher imports. Second, we also find that this impact is higher in countries that have lower debt levels. And this is because the economic agents in the country are probably less likely to become concerned with the increase in debt in the near or medium term. Also, fiscal stimulus measures appear to be particularly helpful when economic activity, which here we are proxying by NO2 emissions or mobility, is very low, because these measures provide much needed support during the recession or the downturn. But finally, when we find that during those months of low economic activity, so when we are controlling for mobility, fiscal measures have also significant effects when containment measures are being eased. Or in other words, when the supply side restrictions on the economy are being lifted, as this possibly offers more opportunity for these fiscal measures to circulate in the economy. So this is my concluding slide. Let me sum up everything we covered so far. We all know that unfortunately the pandemic is far from over, and even though containment measures are being loosened, economic activity is not back to normal. So when you look at the chart here, when we observe the decline in NO2 emissions, we estimate that the losses in industrial production during the lockdown period, or the first lockdown period, could have been reduced by almost 12% 30 days after the implementation of containment measures. However, when we look at the easing, at the rebound in economic activity after the relaxing or the easing of containment measures, we find that the gains in economic activities are only about half of the losses that we registered during the lockdown phase. So, in other words, the scarring from the COVID-19 pandemic is already evident because of this weak economic recovery that we are witnessing. And we can explain it by many factors. For example, the fact that containment measures are still in place. Some containment measures are still in place to reduce contagion and also to maintain social distancing, but also in the fact that individual behavior has changed during these past few months because of the fear of being exposed or getting infected. And so going forward, we have a lot of work to do, and it is crucial to limit further scarring and lay the foundation for a stronger recovery. The lessons that we learned so far from the Asia pandemic, from Asia's experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, are quite useful, and especially in the cases of another wave of infection. And I will sum them up again quickly. The first one is to act fast, to flatten the pandemic curve. The second is to put in place strong testing and tracing policies that avoid another wave of infections. The third is to get the timing of exit right and to roll back containment measures only after the outbreak has been stable. And last, and certainly but not least, to continue to use supportive macroeconomic policies that can mitigate the adverse costs of containment measures and also sustain the recovery going forward. I will stop here. Thank you. Do we move on immediately to Tahsin?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay.
So let me share my screen. Thank you, and good afternoon. It's working, yes. So I will present the analytical chapter on COVID-19 and inequality. You had a big team, you can see at the bottom of this slide. So they worked on different aspects of that chapter. This is the outline of the presentation. I will try to cover these 5 topics. First, we will look at the key inequality trends before COVID-19. Second, we will look at some early evidence from high-frequency labor surveys on the rise of inequality. Then we will look at the pandemics and automation, pandemics and social unrest, and finally, we'll discuss our policies. Before going into the details, let me first highlight the 4 key messages from our study. First, inequality has steadily increased in Asia, even before the pandemic, and more so than in other regions. Second, the crisis is likely to increase inequality further in the medium term including via an acceleration in automation. Third, this may have negative consequences for social stability, especially in countries with already high inequality. And fourth, redistributive policies are key to prevent such consequences and help save lives. Let's look at the key inequality trends in Asia before the pandemic. I will make a couple of observations. First, the change in Asia's income inequality, the delta, was the highest, as we can see on the left chart. This reflects larger income gains for the top 10% of the population, as shown on the red line on the right chart. Second, from a gender perspective, Asia had the second highest gender income gap, shown on the left chart. Another trend shown on the right chart is that the share of youth not in education and employment in Asian emerging market and developing economies is the largest as compared to its peers. And more than 60% of those are women. The third observation is that Asia's share of informality ranked the second highest. Informal workers, as we know, are more likely to belong to poor households. Asia also has a very low redistributive income policies, shown on the right chart. In general, safety nets are very low in the region. Finally, apart from inequality of outcome, Asia is also confronted with considerable inequality of opportunities, such as access to education, health, and financial services. Let's now look at the likely effect of the pandemic on inequality in Asia. In this section, we use high-frequency labor survey data to identify which types of workers or sectors are more impacted by the pandemic. We find that Asia's labor market conditions have deteriorated significantly more than during the global financial crisis. Aggregate hours worked have declined, both at the extensive employment rate and the intensive margins hour worked per employee. Unemployment has surged and labor force participation plunged. These are early signs of scarring effect. Like in other regions, the pandemic is a worsening distributional outcome in Asia. As we will see in the next 3 slides, job losses are concentrated in industries with lower wages, among women and youth. The crisis is affecting all industries, but high contact sectors, such as hospitality and retail, and no teleworkable industries, such as mining, manufacturing, and construction, are experiencing the larger decline, as we can see on the left chart. These sectors have a large share of low-skilled workers and lower earning. This is shown in the middle chart. And sectors with already low level of earnings saw a larger decline in wage growth. This is shown on the right chart. Labor force participation rates for women fell by a larger magnitude as compared to men. This is shown on the right chart. Women represent a large share of essential workers on the front line. Industries that were hit hard by the pandemic also predominantly employed women. This is shown on the left chart. Looking at the wage dimension, Asia's youth experienced sharp job losses compared to other workers during the pandemic. This is shown on the left chart. Workers with primary education and below have been the most affected by the pandemic. This is shown by the red bar in the right chart. So to sum up, the pandemic is exacerbating and amplifying some of the existing inequality trends we observed earlier. Let's turn to the pandemics and automation. Empirical studies, including here at the fund by Davide and co-authors, suggest that major pandemics over the past 2 decades, even though much smaller in scale than COVID-19, have led to persistent increases in income inequality. In this study, we look at one of the channels through which pandemics may increase inequality, namely the acceleration in automation, especially robotization. Like other technological changes, by reducing costs and improving productivity, robots may boost economic growth. But the fear is that they may also disrupt labor markets in transition as they take over tasks and make traditional jobs obsolete. Moreover, robots do not affect all workers in the same way. Low-skilled workers are more at risk from displacement by robots than high-skilled workers, reinforcing inequality dynamics. We focus on two questions. Will the COVID-19 pandemic accelerate robotization? If so, what's the distributional impact of robotization? The left chart shows the impulse response from local projection method, which show that robot adoption, as measured by new robot installation per 1,000 employees, tends to increase after a pandemic. The chart on the right shows that the increase in inequality over the medium term tends to be larger for economy with higher robot density, above 2.3 per thousand, and where robot adoptions increase more after the pandemic. This result suggests that the distributional effect of the pandemic could be sizable in Asia. Indeed, Asia has been at the forefront of robot adoption. For example, in 2018, nearly 2/3 of the world's operational stock of industrial robots were in Asia, and more than 40% of the world's new robots were installed in China, as we can see on the left chart. Moreover, robot density is high and rising fast in several Asian economies, as we can see on the right chart. Let's now turn to the impact of pandemic on social unrest. As motivation, let me start with this quote from Deaton. Pandemics may turn tolerable inequalities into intolerable inequalities. In this study, we measure social unrest by the Civil Disorder Score in the International Country Risk Guide, ICRG. The chart shown here indicates that social unrest has increased since the global financial crisis. The original Civil Disorder Score ranged from 0 to 4, with a higher score indicating less disorder. In the next few slides, we have inverted the sign, so an increase means more social unrest. First, to quantify the impact of pandemic events on social unrest, we apply local projection method to monthly data shown on the left chart. We find that the social unrest increases significantly 14 months after a pandemic event. The impact is not significant for earlier period. We also estimate a panel VAR model to shed light on the channels through which pandemic lead to social unrest. We look at inequality and growth as two possible channels. Similarly, we find that risk of social unrest increased significantly 1 year after a pandemic event, as shown on the right chart. The effect is also persistent over time. After 5 years, the risk of social unrest increased by about 20%. Second, we assess the impact of pandemic on inequality and growth. We find that net Gini increased significantly 2 years after a pandemic event, and the effect is persistent. This is shown on chart A1 on the left. On growth, the effect of pandemics on output is immediate and persistent. This is shown on chart A2. Third, we assess the impact of higher inequality and lower growth on social unrest. The risk of social unrest increases significantly after an increase in net Gini. This is shown on chart B. The risk of social unrest also increases substantially after a negative growth shock, and the effect is persistent. This is shown on the right chart. Finally, we found that the risk of higher social unrest is usually followed by greater inequality and lower output, thus forming a vicious cycle. This vicious cycle is summarized in this circular diagram. We go one step further by asking whether there is a certain threshold in which further increase in inequality will have significant effect on social unrest. As shown on the left chart, we find evidence that the effect of inequality on social unrest is stronger when income inequality is initially high. When initial net Gini is below 40, an increase in inequality has no significant effect on social unrest. When initial net Gini is above 40, a rise in inequality increases social unrest and the effect strengthens with higher inequality. About 46% of countries in the world and 1/3 of Asian economy have a net Gini above 40, as we can see on the right chart. Turning to policies. First, what Asian countries have done in response to the pandemic and what they should do then next from our model. So first, the ability of countries to respond to COVID-19 emergency was not unlimited. Fiscal response depended on the amount of fiscal space. As we can see on these charts, countries with lower deficit and with lower debt at the end of 2019, before the pandemic, were able to devote more resources to combating the pandemic. Second, Asian countries entered the COVID-19 crisis with a very different level of social protection for the poorest. We found that countries with broader social safety nets have been able to respond more effectively in protecting the vulnerable. Third, measures to help vulnerable workers and firms also depended on the state of digital adoption. Advanced economy introduced targeted cash transfer more than emerging market and developing economies did. The degree of digitalization likely played a role helping to reach citizens in need. Low income and emerging market countries that introduced targeted cash transfers, for example, Cambodia and India, had on average higher digitalization score than those that did not introduce these measures. Greater efforts to better target fiscal support to protect the most vulnerable is essential. Targeted support provides greater bang for the buck, both in protecting lives and livelihood. This is important because to varying degree, fiscal space is scarce everywhere. Public debt burdens are already a concern of a number of countries, especially in emerging markets and low-income economies. For our policy recommendation, we use a novel SIR macro fiscal inequality model by Engler and co-authors. The model adds fiscal policy and inequality dimensions to the seminal model by Ekenboom and co-authors by distinguishing between high-income skilled and low-income unskilled workers. It also includes redistributive fiscal policy and external borrowing in the form of the pandemic bond. The model is used to perform several comparisons among different sets of fiscal policy measures during a pandemic. Our analysis show that fiscal policy measures not only mitigate the economic cost of the pandemic, but can significantly reduce the number of infections, about 1/3 relative to no infection baseline. By helping to protect the livelihood of the consumers and workers and increasing their disposable income, this measure makes staying home more affordable and help reinforce greater social distancing. The model mimics some feature of the pandemic and lockdown. For example, consumption fell more for skilled workers with higher income and greater discretionary spending, and unskilled low-income workers are more exposed to the pandemic through their workplace, as seen in transport, retail, production lines, and meat processing plants. We compare targeted fiscal support, progressive taxes and transfers, to untargeted general transfers and no progressivity in taxes, and find that favorable effects from policies are larger for targeted than for untargeted measures. Targeted measures help reduce inequality in disposable income and preserve higher consumption share of GDP for the unskilled. This saves more lives because unskilled workers tend to be more exposed to the health crisis. The reduction in infections and fatalities in turn help reduce the depth of the recession and therefore flatten the surge in debt to GDP ratio. The analysis helps hone in our policy recommendations. Given the worsening of the underlying inequality trend exacerbated by the pandemic, it's optimal to continue targeted support measures to mitigate the pandemic and lockdown impact. Enhancing progressivity of taxes and transfers could help mitigate the anticipated buildup in debt that could otherwise pose medium-term debt sustainability risks. Let me stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me. I don't know if you can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Let me close my microphone. So.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. I'd like to open the floor for questions. There was a question in the chat by Elias. I would like to ask him if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. That is a bit of an unfair question because any results that have been derived during the crisis, unfortunately, may become obsolete quite soon. And it relates mostly to the first presentation. So as I have written in the chat, we have had quite a varying experience especially in Europe. And we have also had a smaller scale resurgence of cases in Southeast Asia. So if I were to take the observations of the first presentation and I had to relate them to the current situation in Europe, tensions between central and local governments, how certain non-essential seemingly sectors like arts or dining or tourism, etc., have been cut down, and how the public has been accepting or not accepting the measures. How would those results still be relevant given the evolution of the second wave and the policies relating to the second wave?
Thank you, Elias.
Thank you,
Elias.
Yes, please. Should I take the question, or Davide, did you want to go first? Or I'll say a few things, but yeah, I'll let Davide also add if he wants. I mean, you ask a very relevant and timely question, and also, like you said, you know, by the time we had written up this chapter and done with it, we already now we see this second wave, especially in Europe, and we see also strong lockdowns taking place in Europe. You know, the chapter definitely, you're right also about the question of the balance, because we know that containment measures are effective, but they're very costly. So, you know, it's very important to strike a balance. Now, when you look at the lessons from Asia, I'm going to say that they're simple. I mean, they're simple, but they're not easy. So, for example, the first lesson, which it's one of my, I think, the most important lesson on the importance of acting fast. So, for example, moving forward to put in place containment measures quickly can be very effective in containing or curbing the pandemic before you actually get to the stage where you need to implement a full lockdown, which is shown also by the model simulation, because by that time it's more costly on lives and it's more costly on economic activity. And actually more frequently now we are seeing targeted lockdowns. We are seeing countries in Asia that are moving towards implementing targeted lockdowns on areas or, you know, states where they experience an outbreak, and they, you know, they put down in place these targeted measures quickly to avoid the spread to the rest of the country. We saw this in Korea and also recently in Australia and in Malaysia. So, for example, and then the other lesson, for example, was to ramp up testing and tracing, and to throughout the first wave, but also afterwards, after the wave of infection recedes. And this will have twofold measures, which are also shown in the charts. One of them is that, of course, it helps curb infections, but it also helps for confidence to rebound in the country, or this fear to recede. So when you see that there's a recession in the fear, then you are encouraged to go out more. We see a rebound in mobility, and also this helps support specific sectors that are hit, but namely like the services sectors. But the third thing that I want to say is that even though, even if you take all these examples, we still have sectors, and especially the services sectors, like you mentioned, the arts sectors, that are likely to continue to be constrained or hit during the pandemic because they are high contact sectors. So no matter what, they will continue to suffer during the pandemic and probably after the pandemic is over because of any scarring effects. And this is, for example, where lesson 4 comes to play, that supportive macroeconomic policies should continue to play the role of supporting these sectors and helping these sectors until, we're all out of the woods. So I'll stop here, but I'll let Davide add something.
No, I think what you answered, I think is great, and I think it covers all the aspects. I think if I may add, I think I think the lessons are clearly there, in the sense that we see a huge, completely different performance pattern from few countries that have acted fast, have exited when things were under control, than others, including Europe. I think your question is mostly, how do we can make sure that citizens will understand that tough decisions have to be made, in the sense that one striking thing that we observe, for example, in Europe, is that at least compared to Asia, and this was one of the charter presentation, was that containment measures were lifted when cases were still relatively high. And this, of course, has been, I think, one key element that has brought the third wave much earlier, but also much larger than compared to Asia now. Another factors, again, I think that seems that we still didn't learn or is not feasible, is to act fast. Again, we see now that countries, if you think about Italy and France, they almost introduced containment measures when they reach the record peak in terms of infections, at least in terms of declared case. So it's clear that these are tough choices and are not easy to do. Some countries, because of their political institution or because of the cultural characteristics, tends to upset more some designs of containment measures. Others, they tend to accept less. So this is, I think, is something that we have to keep in mind. But I think that the lesson can really be translated even for the third wave of pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I am mostly covered, and I would agree that your results are very relevant when it comes to the outcomes of how we dealt with the first wave. It is just that as the second wave, especially in Europe, has progressed, and even from EU officials, there has been the question on whether a combination of an open functioning economy and COVID prevention measures is even feasible, or if we're simply buying time until we finally enter a final lockdown.
I think it's feasible if it's done well, in the sense, think about Korea. So Korea has never actually even imposed a significant lockdown as have done other countries in Asia or other countries in Europe, but they have a fantastic strong policies in terms of contact tracing and testing, much more than the way that European countries have done. Look also at the ability of the ability to act fast. So China, for example, to give you another example, didn't have many infections for many weeks. Most of the infections were sort of exported infections, so were traveling coming to China once China's reopened. It happened, I think, a couple of weeks ago that there were few infections that were not able to trace to traveling. And basically they test in one day or in a few days an entire city of 20 million people. This is not something that it happens in Europe. I am Italian, I know that in many countries, testing is not always so straightforward.
I am, and I am Greek, and things are pretty much the same. We're locked down because there's nothing we can do.
The lessons are there. The question is, so we know what to do. The question is how probably we don't know, or it's difficult to apply what to do. I think this is the main problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's great. I think we have one more question by Chuki Gu. I hope I'm not mispronouncing. Then if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I have a question about the monetary policy of the US Fed. I wonder, after the successful invention of the vaccine, will we see an exit in the easing of its monetary policy?
And say something. Well, I mean, most of the market do not expect any change in monetary policy stance in the US as well as in other key advanced economies for now. So at least until the recovery is really entrenched. Of course, the vaccine is a positive news. We've seen that the market has mildly reacted to this, but there are still many uncertainty on how the vaccine will. The vaccine development will proceed. So how fast the vaccine will come, how rapidly will be managed to vaccinate a large share of the population. So there are huge uncertainty. And as of now, most of the market expect that monetary policy in the US as well as in other advanced economies to remain as accommodative as it is now, at least.
That's wonderful. Ask if there are any more questions. I mean, we are just in time now. I mean, it's 5 to 5 here. No? All right. Then if there are no more questions, I would like to conclude, and we can do a virtual round of applause. And it's a real, thank you so much for sharing with us this exciting findings from the IMF. Really appreciate. It's unfortunate that we're not now going to a very, very nice English pub, but we just unfortunately just go back to our sad lives under lockdown.
Now, hopefully we can do next year.
Next year,
hopefully next year.
Well, I hope this is enticing you enough. Nour, the same thing. Thank you so much for the presentation. Tahsin, Davide, thank you very, very much. We're looking forward to see you next year, and I promise you a really exciting and wonderful English pub at the end.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
No, ciao.